everybody. How we doing? Did we enjoy Bert Folsom again? Amazing. Well, I have the honor of introducing our next phenomenal speaker, Congressman Chip Roy. Representative Roy is a former federal prosecutor and top advisor to many prominent Texas elected officials. He previously served as chief of staff to Senator Ted Cruz, staff director of Senator John Cornyn's leadership office, and senior counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee. The congressman has spent numerous years outside of politics, including working as an investment banking analyst, a technology consultant, and as a counsel in the oil and gas industry. Congressman Roy brings a wealth of public and private sector experience to the House GOP conference. A dedicated conservative with the track record to prove it, Roy is committed to restoring healthcare freedom, protecting our borders, defending the sanctity of human life, supporting the men and women of the military, reducing federal spending, and limiting government to promote freedom and opportunity for all Americans. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Chip Roy.
Well, good morning, y'all. How's it going? Y'all having fun? You know, I get a lot more out of this than you probably are going to get out of whatever I have to say. I've enjoyed so much being a part of some of these talks. I've gone out to California. The Young America's Foundation is fantastic. And you know what's funny about California? There are a lot more Republicans in California than there are even in Texas. The problem is you're just outnumbered. And so we got to do something about that. We got to flip California. But I'm just so glad you guys are here, and I'm just so proud to associate with the Young America's Foundation. The one thing that everybody knows about the Young America's Foundation is its deep and long-standing relationship with President Ronald Reagan and President Ronald Reagan's legacy. And the reality is, 60 years ago, in 1964, in October, there was an important race going on between Barry Goldwater and LBJ. President Reagan made clear at that time that it was a time for choosing. How many of you have listened to and studied the president's Time for Choosing speech in 1964? A few of you. I encourage you all to watch it sometime today. Pull it up and listen to it, okay? That speech was an enormously important inflection point in our country at a time when William F. Buckley and at a time when we had the National Review getting created, and you had Barry Goldwater and President Reagan. And that speech is something that sort of set the tone for where we were in the 1960s as a conservative movement. And what he said was that it was a time for choosing, but it wasn't just a choice between Barry Goldwater and LBJ. It was about whether we would choose to defend our very way of life as Americans, to live free according to the founding bedrock principles that give us that life. Or would we choose the siren song of welfare and government and expansion of government-funded programs that bind us with the chains of servitude? That was the question that he was posing before the American people. Because no matter which way you look at things, almost every metric he rattled off in that speech, and again, I encourage you to go listen to it, is far worse today than it was then. Our debt is higher. Our deficits are higher. Our inflation is through the roof. The regulatory state is more complex and more burdensome. The size of government is bigger. And the security of our nation, from our streets to our borders, from our global engagement to the readiness of our military, is decidedly less secure. National debt in 1964 was $311 billion. That's about $2.5 trillion adjusted for inflation. As many of you all know, what is it today? $35 trillion if you round. Reagan talked about a $17 million a day deficit in 1964. Today it is $10 billion per day, meaning that we're now adding another trillion to the debt every 100 days. That's debt you all are going to have to carry. But those are just numbers. Hard to understand them. Hard to understand what 10 billion means or another trillion or 35 trillion even means. In 1964, though, the average home cost $18,900. That's about $192,000 if you adjust it for inflation today. But the median house cost as of this month is $426,900. Meaning you're wondering, as my staff wonders, whether you can buy a home. especially as interest rates go up. And it's primarily because the people in this town, in the swamp, as President Trump refers to it, are selling off your future. And they do it to get reelected. And they do it because they're afraid to get criticized for voting against some program that sounds good. Do you know how many times I've voted for something that feels good and sounds good? I'm a cancer survivor. I've voted against cancer research. I've friends, well, yeah, thank you for both. Thank you for both. I've got friends of mine who have fought the dreaded disease ALS, but I voted against ALS research. You know why? Because we don't have any more money. Okay? Should we research ALS? Of course we should. But it was unfunded. If you want to do more research on ALS, go find funding. Go cut funding from United Nations or the NEA or the UNRWA programs that are funding the Palestinian terrorists attacking Israel. But that's right. And my colleagues continue to do it also because the big multinational corporations that donate to them want them to. Yet Americans, your families, your parents, people around this country are struggling. Most of the jobs that are coming back from the economy destroyed during COVID shutdowns are going to foreign workers, not American-born workers. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, May, showed that foreign-born workers in the United States gained 637,000 jobs year over year, while native-born workers lost roughly 299,000. Do you hear the press reporting that? But the thing is, we feel it. Our parents feel it. Our families feel it. The simple fact of the matter is that there's not a single aspect of your life that bureaucrats and uniparty politicians in this town are not actively making worse. For those of you who went to government schools, they've been trying to brainwash you with anti-American, anti-Western civilization ideas since the moment you first walked through the doors. I say that as somebody who only went to government schools, K through 12. I went to then the University of Virginia. I got my master's at the University of Virginia. I went to the University of Texas School of Law. My wife grew up, went to public schools, raised by a single mom. She went to Texas A&M University, so we cover both. We cover both. So we've got, my dad went to Texas Tech. We really try to cover the whole state of Texas. So the fact is, I only went to public or government-run schools. But they were different in the 1980s. And today, it is a purposeful effort to try to indoctrinate the next generation. And those of you who've gone through those schools, you know it. And you've survived it, and you're here, and you get it. But how many millions of your cohorts don't? That's the question. Yours also was the generation that was robbed of years of education and human connection through school lockdowns and distance learning and shutting down the greatest economy in the history of the world. Experts can guess at what the impact of that and those tyrannical policies will be for generations to come. But you understand it intuitively because you've experienced it. Then they told you wouldn't be able to get a meaningful job without going to get a degree at a four-year college. So they expect you to sign up for a lifetime of student loan debt. Don't worry, yours won't be paid off. Only to be further indoctrinated by leftist professors and DEI administrators whose salaries are heavily subsidized by American taxpayers, racking up even more debt, and then have the government choose to so-called forgive that debt for some, but not others. In 1980, the price to attend a four-year college full-time was $10,231, adjusted for inflation. By 2019 to 2020, the total price increase was almost $30,000. And obviously, it's higher for a lot of other institutions. That means it became 3 times more expensive. Meanwhile, it's also more expensive for the taxpayer. From 1977 to 2021, in inflation-adjusted dollars, state and local government spending on higher education went from $116 billion to $311 billion. Again, that's adjusted for inflation. So we're paying for all the extra indoctrination. We're paying for all the useless diversity officers and other administrators whose only job is to put together a PowerPoint presentation about how white people are evil and how men can get pregnant. But that's what they're doing. And it's not just there. It's all throughout government. It's in our military. It's in the Secret Service training. This is all happening. It's real. If you manage to avoid the higher ed indoctrination trap and you walk out of college with $100,000 worth of debt for a taxpayer-subsidized degree in transgender basket weaving or some other nonsense, you're walking into a world of record home costs, high mortgage rates, record inflation, where more jobs are going to foreign-born workers, like I said. And don't get me started on health care. I could give an entire speech on health care. You all are young and healthy. You really, frankly, most of you haven't had to deal with it that much yet. I was young and healthy, and at 37, boom, was diagnosed with cancer. You need a healthcare system that will work. But right now, the average family of four is paying $25,000 a year in combined employer subsidy and personal payments to large corporate whores who are so-called health insurance companies that are not really insurance, but health management bureaucrats that exist to limit your access to health care not provided, limit the number of options you have, limit the number of doctors you can go to, and make it more expensive. You got to call some bureaucrat to ask permission to find a doctor within a 2-hour drive that might be able to provide you care. And that has been done through government regulation, government fiat, and corporations making billions of dollars on back of the corporate cronyism. That's what's been happening. Meanwhile, you can't even live according to your beliefs. If you want to have children in this country and raise them in accordance with your faith, to have traditional values, to stand up for the sanctity of life, you run the risk of being targeted by the FBI. A 75-year-old grandmother is facing 2 years in prison. She's going to report to prison in a week in Texas because she prayed at an abortion clinic in Washington, D.C. Imagine that. That happened. This government is doing that. If you go to a school board meeting to stand up for your daughter, like my friend Scott Smith in Loudoun County, Virginia did, you may end up labeled a domestic terrorist. Meanwhile, when you put your kids to bed at night, you have to worry about whether you're going to be safe in your own home because radical progressive Democrats, radical district attorneys paid for by George Soros throughout this country are letting violent criminals out on the streets, and the current administration has imported and released into your communities thousands of violent foreign criminals through our wide open southern border. Laken Riley was a student in Georgia, a student like you all. She's now dead at the hands of a criminal unlawfully released by a radical progressive Democrat regime into this country in the name of so-called parole. She should be alive today. She should still be at school today like you all. Rachel Marin, a single mother of 5 from Maryland, just up the road from here. She's no longer with us. She should be alive today. Kayla Hamilton in the same community, just up the road from here in Maryland. She should be alive today. Jocelyn Nungare, 12-year-old little girl in Houston. She should be alive today. Lizbeth Medina in Texas. I'm doing these from memory, by the way. She should be alive today. These are people that are no longer here because radical progressive Democrats want to allow criminals to come into our country in the false name of compassion while little girls get sold into the sex trafficking trade in Texas and throughout this country. Let's be clear about the state of open borders and immigration. The radical progressive Democrat machine is doing everything they can to transform their country through voter importation, and they have admitted it. You have been taught that unlimited immigration is good. It's only as good as a nation committed to our own sovereignty and our own beliefs and our willingness to make sure that everyone will be a part of the American fabric. What if I told you that there are 51.5 million foreign-born people in the United States today? What if I told you that that number is approaching 1 in 6, is the highest in our history? What if I told you the current administration has released another 5 million people, including known criminals and terrorists from 161 countries, into the United States? What if I told you they've added another 1 to 2 million gotaways and we don't even know where they're from, who they are, or where they are today? Why do you think that's happening? Do you think it's in the name of compassion? Do you think it's good? Do you think it's good for migrants? Do you think it's good for the little girls? Do you think it's good for our communities? Do you think the education system is going to train the people coming here to believe in Western civilization, believe in God, and believe in the greatness of this country? But it's a bipartisan problem. I want to be very clear sitting in this room. A lot of tough-talking Republicans rattle about the border, give speeches about the border, but have long been willing to do the bidding of corporate interest to leave you exposed to dangerous open borders, all allegedly to keep the flow of cheap labor so they can go to the Chamber of Commerce and say thank you, never minding the massive welfare state building to support them. How many of you are familiar with Milton Friedman, famous economist, free market economist? That's right. If you're not, go read some Friedman. He famously said he was very much for open borders. Now, I would note that was pre-9/11. It was in a slightly different era, the 1970s. But he was very much for open borders if you don't have a welfare state. We do. That matters. And we also have a dangerous world. The fact is, the radical progressive Democrat of today is actively working to remake America. And the sad thing is that Republicans and self-described conservatives have chosen to let them succeed for far too long, and in the process have combined to destroy the American dream. Reagan's time for choosing speech was 60 years ago. That generation chose wrong. I want to repeat that. Ronald Reagan's speech 60 years ago, which called for a time for choosing, they chose wrong. They didn't choose the path that President Reagan laid out. They chose the easy path of more government spending, increased regulation, mass importation, cultural appeasement, abandonment of the fundamental responsibility of government to secure the blessings of liberty. But here's the good news. The fact that you're here, we don't have to make that choice today. We can choose a different path. America doesn't have to look like this. President Reagan said that the freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It's one of my favorite quotes from him. But I also believe that the reverse of that statement is also true. Americans are also never more than one generation away from reclaiming freedom, reclaiming the prosperity that it provides, and reclaiming the national greatness that flows from embracing it. To be clear, we've had lower points in our history. We've been put to the test in the form of civil wars, civil unrest, armed rebellions, economic catastrophes, the Depression, terrorist attacks like 9/11, which most of you weren't even alive or barely remember. But Americans have always gotten back up. And I believe that we can get back up again. But like with every other real challenge that we face in our personal lives, whether it's cancer, whether it's something else that you face, the only way out of this is through, to borrow the words from Robert Frost, to choose the road less traveled, to choose the hard but much more fulfilling path. And that's what I want you to take away from here today. I'm not here to be the funny guys from the Babylon Bee. They're going to make you laugh, okay? I'm not here to tell you the stories that some people have had in personal experiences, like the young woman from North Korea, which is an extraordinary story, or Paula Scanlon, who's going to address you afterwards. And she's a great hero like Riley Gaines and others to stand up against the woke culture. I'm here to challenge you. I'm here to tell you that we're going to have to, together, your generation, with hopefully from some leadership from the generation that grew up under Reagan, we're going to have to choose the hard path if we want to save freedom for you, your kids, and your grandkids. That's not an easy speech. People always ask me, well, why do Democrats, their speeches are so easy and, they can go out and, everybody can unite. Well, it's really easy when you're selling free stuff. It really is. Here's more free stuff. Here's more what the government can do for you. The question is what are you willing to say no to in order to save this great experiment? What are you willing to say, I'm willing to take the tougher path so that my kids in this country can be free? One of the biggest reasons I do this job is because I'm the dad of 2 teenagers. I want to hand down to them a country worth having. I leave my wife, I leave my 10 acres and enjoyable life in Texas with brisket and beer and barbecue and live music. And I was at Lukenbach last week, listening to William Beckman and Pat Green and Corey Morrow and a bunch of the great guys, the great singers in Texas. I recommend it. It's a good life. I once hung out in Lukenbach, Texas with Clarence Thomas. Pretty much the highlight of my political existence. And I leave that great, wonderful piece of dirt in the hill country of Texas to come here, not to hang out in this place, I can assure you, but because I want to leave each of you in this room a country worth having. I believe it can be greater. I can believe it can be freer than the one even I grew up in. We can live in a place where the quality of a child's education is not determined by their zip codes or the power of union bosses, but by the informed and free choices of his or her parents. We can live in a country where colleges focus on education, liberal education, classical liberal education, instead of indoctrination, and where they don't saddle both students and taxpayers with mountains of debt in the process. We can live in a place where healthcare is actually made affordable because it's no longer dictated to you by government bureaucrats and corporate cronies where innovation, price transparency, and freedom drive down the cost for all, and where the doctor-patient relationship is truly king. We can have a country where high school graduates can learn a simple trade, a young man and a young woman, and yes, those are the two options, can marry, work, and feed and care for their family and actually put away money for a down payment on a house, all without reliance upon government, but simply personal responsibility and hard work. We used to call that and other things the American dream, and we still can. We can have a country in which you raise a family according to the truths given to us by a loving God and the words given us by the author of creation, and not have to worry about getting targeted by a weaponized federal government for doing so. We can have a job market that serves American citizens and legal workers. We can have elections that we trust because we demand proof that only citizens can vote, where our citizenship once again means what it used to. We can live in a country where our borders are secure, our streets are safe, and we are free from dangerous narcotics pouring into our communities and poisoning our families and killing our fellow Americans. We can once again restore peace through strength, the strength of a mighty and unequal but sparingly used military. We can avoid endless, drawn-out conflict, but still stop the march of tyranny and communism and aggression around the globe for our own national security interests and the betterment of the world. We can have a clean and healthy environment in which we use the blessings of natural resources for reliable power to advance the flourishing of man, not a cult where people worship the idea of climate more than the Lord Almighty. We can return to the simple idea that we are all created equal, but there are no guaranteed outcomes, that we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, that government doesn't exist to divide us by race, but to unite us by our common interests as Americans in one simple goal: the revival of the American dream. We can revive that dream with your help and your work. We have a duty to revive the dream because this country and what it has stood for and what it has meant for almost 250 years is worth fighting for. I'm going to take my 13-year-old daughter over into Arlington National Cemetery when I leave here. And we're going to go to the changing of the guard. And I'm going to go walk around the cemetery. There are 400,000 tombstones over there of individuals who either gave the last full measure of devotion or were ready to give the last full measure of devotion so that you could be here today expressing what you believe. Those are the most important, to borrow from my friend Governor Ron DeSantis from Florida, those are the most important monuments in this town. If you haven't been there, go. If you've already been there, go again. None of these other monuments that you go to, none of them matter without those monuments. But what did they either die for or what were they willing to die for? It wasn't to be slave to government. It wasn't to beg your local bureaucrats what your kids can learn while you pay taxes and you're slave to the bureaucracy. It wasn't so that you had to wonder what their health care was going to be. It wasn't to let criminals out on your streets. Now is the time to reclaim our birthright as Americans. 1964 was a time for choosing. And many tried to choose the right path. And President Reagan, when he was president, fought to try to choose the right path. And it has been an ongoing battle for the last 60 years. But we know the right path. So today in 2024, we must take it. It will require sacrifice. It will require waking up with purpose. It will require turning down the comforts propped up for too long by the post-World War II generation Americans who, with all due respect to your parents and mine, let you down. You will have to say no. It's the most powerful and effective weapon for freedom ever devised. The courage to say no. You will have to say no to the repeatedly proven false promise that government can provide for you. It cannot. In the very first essay of the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton put it in stark and direct terms. It seems, quote, "It seems to have been reserved to the people for this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." End quote. We can fight right now for policies and ideas based on freedom that will make us better off and more prosperous right now. And those are good things. But we have a much greater responsibility before us. You cannot be free if your government owns you. You can and must choose to reject the chains of welfare and the false promise of statism. Government, as President Reagan said, is not the solution, it is the problem. We cannot print, we cannot borrow, we cannot spend our way to actual prosperity by promising the government will care for you. It will be the same government that's giving you your Social Security check, the same government that's giving you Medicare payments, the same government that's paying off your student loans, the same government that's trying to subsidize every aspect of your life, is the same government that shut down the greatest economy in the history of the world, shoved you all into the corners of rooms in your schools, and made it to where it was impossible for us to come together in our own churches or for a husband and wife to be able to hold hands when one of them was on their deathbed during COVID. That is the power of government, and it's being used against you. And the reason is because we've allowed it and we've given it the power. And the only way to avoid that is to say no. Say no to the welfare state that gets you hooked. The American dream depends on the achievement of the American spirit unshackled by government. You can only be free if you're willing to struggle, suffer, and live with risk. You are not free if you wish to choose someone else's promise that you will be comfortable. I want to be as direct as I can be. Mary and Joseph were famously told when seeking a place to rest that night that there was no room in the inn. There is no room left in the government funding Ponzi scheme your parents and grandparents have sold you. And my parents and grandparents have sold me. It's gone. They've made empty promise after empty promise of welfare payments, healthcare subsidies, promised retirement funding, tax credits, unlimited grants, research funding, war funding, student loan subsidies, and bailouts. And it's not just the $35 trillion in debt, which you don't even know what that number means, and neither do I. It means inflation, it means a weaker dollar. But what it really means, the destruction of the American soul. The immigrants who came here to live a better life, to create an opportunity. The people who came here knowing that they would have to toil and work and achieve the American dream, but there was no guaranteed outcome. You are going to be the generation that reverses it. I believe that. With a little help from the OG Reagan generation. Those of us ready to leap beyond the baby boomer hippie generation that's been destroying America. And that's not easy to say. We have less than 2 years until this country turns 250 years old. July 2nd, 2026, we'll turn 250. It's been remarked by many that this puts us past the average life expectancy of a representative government through the history of mankind. The Scottish historian Alexander Fraser Tytler is famous for his observation that democracies and republics don't tend to last very long. The average age of the world's greatest civilizations has been 200 years. These nations have progressed through this sequence, from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to apathy, from apathy to dependence, from dependence back into bondage. Listen to those words. If you listen to that warning and you look around at what this country has been doing for the last several decades and that the Washington uniparty forces in this town are up to right now, it doesn't sound good. And if we keep slumping down that road we've been traveling, I don't like our odds. But that does not have to be our destiny. We do not have to give into this cycle, which so many nations have fallen, because that is not what Americans do. We ignore the odds and we dare to live free. The Minutemen of Lexington and Concord looked at the soldiers of the world's most powerful empire, and they said no. When King George III ignored our calls to negotiate and compromise, our forefathers stood up. They signed their death warrants by pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to something that the world told them could not succeed. They said no. When Hitler was marching through Europe and carrying out the great atrocity that was the Holocaust, it was the greatest generation of Americans who jumped off of those boats into stormy waters, ran through a wall of bullets, stormed up to a cliff, scaled the cliffs through enemy gunfire. Once they got to the cliffs, they were told, well, you just won the prize. We've got to march to Germany now. And come Christmas, you get to sit in a foxhole in the freezing cold to stave off the German last effort. If you haven't watched The Band of Brothers, watch it. I mean that. Imagine sitting in that foxhole in December of 1944, and it's 5 degrees, and it's snowing. What were they fighting for? It wasn't for $35 trillion of debt. It wasn't for wide open borders. It wasn't to say that a man can have a baby. It wasn't. They put everything on the line because they knew that living free and putting that freedom toward a greater purpose was much more important than anything they were risking. They risked it all for you. That spirit, just as much as any document they produced or any self-evident truth or any of the writings on any of the walls. I went to UVA. I go to Jefferson Memorial. I love all the words. But it was that spirit, that willingness to scale the cliffs and fight for you that is our inheritance as Americans. Because we as a people are not as free as we should be. We are not as free as we need to be. We are not as free as we have the right to be. And we as lovers of freedom need to declare our own independence once again. A new declaration of independence as we come into 2026. And stand up to all the forces in this town. All of the forces around the world. Stand up to the media. Stand up to the indoctrinationists and universities. Stand up to corporate America. And stand up and reclaim our American birthright. The right to live free. That is the choice we have before us. And I don't know about you all. I choose freedom. Thank you all, and I'll be happy to take your all's questions.
We are now going to begin our Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way back to the room by my colleague. And then remember to state your name, school, and your brief question.
Good morning, Congressman Roy. I'm Michael from Baltimore, Maryland. First of all, I just want to say thank you for coming to speak to us today. I'm the son of 2 immigrants, so legal immigrants, and your speech was everything you said about the immigration, I totally agree with, and I think that's just should be basically acknowledged by everyone else. But my question is about something you said earlier in your speech about the government spending and how you vote against bills that you think have unnecessary spending. I'm wondering, what's the plan within Congress for politicians on both sides of the political divide to start to limit that unnecessary federal spending?
Well, first of all, go Orioles. I was a big Orioles fan growing up. I grew up back in the era of Ripken and Murray and Palmer, and you guys remember any of these guys, but back when they won the World Series in 1983 when I was 11, so that's how old I am. And great to have you here. Appreciate it. You're not going to like my answer. There is no plan. There isn't one. You don't necessarily need a plan. You need courage. Now, let me back up and give you the positive. 18 months ago, when we had the rather infamous debate about the speaker selection, and we tried to force changes into the town, it has had an impact. But it's like sitting on the Titanic looking at the iceberg, and you're grabbing the wheel and you move it about an inch, but the rest of the town is pulling the wheel back in the other direction. You're going, why? Guys, the frickin' iceberg's right up in front of us. But it's just the way this town is wired. It's the way it's set up. Like, right now, this town is wired that when we come back in September, by the way, we just passed 5 of 12 appropriations bills, and we left town for 7 weeks to go campaign. Why? Because everyone's focus is political power. My focus is what the hell you do when you have political power. And then you'll have political power if you lead. So we come back in September, what's going to happen is there's going to be a short-term continuing resolution to keep the government funded until probably December, until Christmas, unless we do something to stop that. When that happens, then there's all the pressure before Christmas to pass some massive omnibus spending bill, cut a deal in the name of our defense, in the name of some other priority, and then you all are left holding the bag of increased spending and increased bureaucracy. We have to break the back of that. And we've got to change the incentives in this town to be concerned about spending. And by the way, and I'm going to say something that flips out some of the pro-growth tax cutting people in this town, and I'm for low taxes. I'm a Reaganite. I believe in low broad tax rate to create economic growth. But let me be very clear. We have these pledges about taxes, but what are we doing about spending? Because if you just keep going over to this side of the ledger and saying, I'm cutting taxes, cutting taxes, cutting taxes in the name of starving government, how's that working out? We're not starving government. We're just printing money to fund government while we then go cut taxes over here. So we've got to have a real, robust conversation about what it means when you go up in September or next year, when Lord willing, President Trump wins and we have the House and we have the Senate. What are we going to do in January to transform the trajectory of this town? I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to take the tough votes. I'm willing to put literally everything on the table to get back to fiscal responsibility. But it's going to take leadership from you all, I mean this, to say, we want responsibility. We're not begging for you to give us the handouts of Social Security in 50 years that we're not even sure is going to exist, or Medicare in 50 years that we're not even sure is going to exist. We want reforms right now. You all are going to have to demand that, with some help, I think, from some of the Reagan generation.
Hello, I'm Isaac from Utah Valley University. And in your address, you mentioned the militiamen from Concord. And a question I've had is, what does a militia look like in 2024? What's a well-regulated militia if it still applies to America today?
Well, it's an interesting question. My chief of staff, Sabrina's right here somewhere. She grew up in Utah. She grew up in Salt Lake City. And Michael Lee's one of my best friends in town. Yeah, and I'm going to try to be mindful. We've got about 10 minutes. I want to try to get through as many questions as I can. So I'm going to try to go a little bit more rapid fire than my last question. But short version is this. The principles are still the same, in my view. But you have to recognize the reality of modern warfare. So you got to recognize the need for the standing army as it relates to the technologies and what we need to have in terms of aircraft carriers, in terms of assets, to be able to carry out global conflict, to be able to engage, to have your elite fighting units. 100% believe that that's appropriate. But you still fundamentally, the strength of our ability to defend ourselves, defend our communities, still lies with the people coming together in their communities and being able to go fight for their country. And I believe that it should start there. I believe that we should have a more invigorated governors, National Guards, the people that are be able to control that more locally. And look, and I'm going to say this here, and I don't know what the response could be in this room. I'm not sure that I believe that the draft ought to exist, but I sure as hell believe that we shouldn't draft our daughters. And so I'm not gonna stand up for that.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Thomas Adcock. I'm from Kansas State University. Go Wildcats. I served 4 years in the United States Army. When I was in the Army, I got told by one of my NCOs that I was too patriotic and maybe less proud to be American. I see this problem occurring all over the military. How do we, going forward, fix this in the military? This was under both Trump and Biden. Yep. So how do we fix this in our military today?
First of all, thank you for your service. God bless you. Appreciate it very much. Second of all, thank you for pointing that out, because we'll say these things, and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle will just laugh and say, oh, that's not true. That doesn't happen. Yet it does. It happens all the time. And we know it happens, and we see the military, and we see the product of it. And I want to go speak directly to this with respect to the Secret Service as an example, because it's most front and center right now. But it's equally as true, or even more so as true for the military. The wokeification of the Secret Service, of the FBI, of the United States military is demonstrably making us less secure. We are not making it to where we're seeking the best. We are lowering standards, and we are putting things that are priorities that shouldn't be priorities when we need the finest fighting men and women that we can possibly have without regard to any lowering of standards, and we need to root out all of that nonsense. It's anti-American. It is demonstrably against what we believe, and it is weakening us. We need to just own it, say it. Like I put out a report with Marco Rubio about 18 months ago about the ridiculous woke policies in the United States military. We've been rooting out and getting whistleblowers and getting us to give us and send PowerPoint presentations. There are example after example after example. It's real. What you just said is true. And we need, Lord willing, President Trump to come in. We need to fire almost the entirety of the top brass of the Pentagon and replace them with God-fearing patriots who want to make the military strong again.
Thank you very much for coming today.
Yeah, pleasure.
My name is Benjamin Schrader from the University of Texas, San Antonio.
Nice.
It's great to see a fellow Texan here, but I have a bit more of a sadder question. I was at the event where Trump was shot in Pennsylvania. Person 10 feet behind me was killed, and I wonder if you believe that we will see more or less political violence and horrific events like this in our country.
Well, great to have you here from Texas. Great to have you here from San Antonio. I proudly represent a good chunk of San Antonio, as you know. Yeah, I'm glad you were at the event. You should not be afraid of going to events. We got to go out and live and be free. You can't run away from the forces of evil. You have to run into the face of the forces of evil if you want to be a free people. And do I believe there might be additional political violence? I mean, it's always possible. It always has existed. Most part of our country has minimized it. But for those that were alive in 1968, right, there was a lot of political violence, right? Whether it was Martin Luther King, whether it was Bobby Kennedy. That was a mere 5 years after Jack Kennedy. If you go back in time, I mean, hell, we had a Secretary of Treasury and a Vice President duel in the streets in 1803 or whatever that was. I mean, this is not new. In fact, politics to some degree used to be a little bit more of a blood sport. There's a hole in the ceiling of the House of Representatives where a shot was shot off, 100 years ago. There will be something again in the future, no doubt. But the way we win is by winning with ideas. The way we win is by not cowering, okay? If those guys walked into the wall of bullets at Normandy, then we show up and we push back on the crazies and the radicals. And we don't let them make us scared. And by the way, the friggin' task force that just got set up needs to actually do something. I'm sick and tired of Congress putting together another group of people to sit around in a room babbling and preening in front of cameras instead of producing something with action. We need to know what happened, get to the bottom of it, reform the Social Security, the Secret Service, reform, all of the entities that are involved with law enforcement, FBI, et cetera. We had Christopher Wray in front of us in the Judiciary Committee the day before yesterday. All of that needs to be reformed from the top down. And so hopefully we'll get that out of this process. All right,
this next question will be our final question.
All right, there we go. I was going to say we could try to rapid fire 2 or 3 more, but anyway, go ahead.
Hello, Congressman. My name is Ethan Blank. I'm attending Harrisburg Area Community College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
My question is, an idea proposed by Vivek Ramaswamy during his presidential campaign was zero-based budgeting, building a spending plan starting from scratch rather than using previous budgets as a baseline. Is this an idea you would support, and what things would definitely not be on the budget?
Well, that's not something I can answer in 2 minutes. But I would also say zero-based budgeting is something that's been around for decades. You go all the way back, and Phil Gramm and others back in the 1980s, and people that were pushing this notion and this idea. Look, we can do zero-based budgeting, and I agree with it. I pushed forward a zero-based budget when we were doing the budget when I was the head of the AG's office in Texas. The problem you have is not the process. The problem you have here is the lack of willingness, resolve, and backbone for Republicans to oppose a feel-good spending measure or a feel-good program. Just this week, we had appropriations votes on the interior and on energy and water. We had votes, for example, on defunding the National Endowment for Humanities. 70 Republicans said, oh, no, we can't cut that, even though it's just chock full of all sorts of liberalism and wokeism. We offered amendment after amendment after amendment cutting spending. Let me give you a good example. Everybody here knows the horrors of October 7th last fall for our friends in Israel. And we just had Prime Minister Netanyahu here. I'm proud to have authored the bill that we passed in the House and had 40 Democrats join us with to sanction the ICC if the ICC tries to go make Netanyahu a war criminal. We passed that, and I'm proud to have led that effort. But we knew that UNRWA, you guys know what I'm talking about? The United Nations, and they've got this refugee program. It has been designed and has been used to funnel dollars to Hamas. And we've known this. And so 4 years ago, I put forward legislation to stop that. We had a vote in the appropriations bills last September to defund UNRWA, and 8 at least Republicans, it might have been more, voted against it, literally 2 weeks before October 7th. My point of this, and I'll have to close with this is the last question. You all need to hold your Republican representatives accountable. If you go work for Republicans on the Hill, ask them why, push, be a part of the conservative movement to change things. But we can't keep doing the same old thing and expecting different results. I'm for zero-based budgeting. I'm for 2-year budgets. I'm for changing all the processes, anything that will stick. But the only thing that will fundamentally change this town is the courage to change it. And it won't happen in Congress unless you all lead it. Because I promise you, members of Congress, they'll do one thing. They'll respond to you. Because they hold on to their election certificates with a death grip. It's like their whole DNA and reason for being. It's pretty sad, really. But you all can force them. You all change the game. That's what I want you all to take away from this. You all hold the power in your hands, your generation, to reclaim freedom for your kids and grandkids. It's been an honor to be here. God bless you all. Appreciate it.